Well, thank you for making some time to speak to me today, Shara. Really appreciate getting this opportunity to learn a bit from your experience, especially since you're at one of the centers that I know we've done some work with in the past. I have a ton of respect for the Access team. And
Thank you.
oh, absolutely. I think this community has really enjoyed kind of getting to hear a little bit about, what our career developers have been through and what employment counselors have kind of done along the way to get there where they are today. Because so many students and so many job seekers kind of think, you graduate school and then you're in this one job that you studied for.
Right.
But there's so many things, right, that happen along the way and so many changes in your life that can change your interests. So before I kind of ask you, for your tips on resumes and networking and interviews,
Mhm.
it'd be really cool to just hear, a little bit about your journey. How did you end up in this field and what kind of things did you do along the way, if you don't mind sharing some of your career highlights with us?
Sure, no problem. So getting into the employment sector was kind of a random turn, actually, as my main focus was getting into immigration. However, as life is never as expected as usual, right? So sometimes it usually takes a little a turns in here and there. So therefore, I started off onto starting like helping people because at the end of the day, like you and I come from immigrant families, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, I like how our parents told us like how they came to Canada, coming to a new country with like a lack of knowledge of different resources. So therefore, now since we are so exposed to different resources, now when we meet new immigrant families and new immigrant individuals, now it's like our sole duty to assist them to help them reintegrate back into the country and then kind of minimize the cultural shock.
Fair enough.
Right. So yes, that's why I kind of took a turn to kind of going to the employment sector, and I kind of it's kind of a good result, anyways, because when you help someone find a job, it's like you get a good deed of helping someone. So it became more of a attraction for me.
Well, that is definitely something I have been trying to raise some awareness around, and maybe even more so just celebrate the role that employment staff play in these people's lives. It's such
Yes.
a valuable resource, and employment's about so much more than just making money. When you think about it, I mean, this is how people are paying for their children's education, for vacations, like we were just talking about. I had the
Yeah.
amazing opportunity to go and be with my sister for the weekend in California with my family. And that's all based on having, a job that not only pays well, but flexible and rewarding. So thank
Hmm.
you, Shara, for the work you do and helping people, find those meaningful roles and works that can help them support their goals and dreams. Um, Now, along the way, have you primarily worked with newcomers, or is it kind of a wide spectrum on people who will end up looking to you for advice and guidance?
Well, it depends on what area of focus, right? So pretty much I used to work with barrier youths to employment, like youths who are having some barriers to employment. And then I kind of shifted my plate to, working with immigrants who wants to look for a just sector focused job. So that's a turn that I took. I want to kind of challenge myself and my skills and kind of like, how can I like open the window more wider and kind of like give and utilize more skills even more, right? So it was a kind of a test because youths is something that it's I don't know how to say it. Like it's something that you can kind of connect a little easier because they're within the age group that you can kind of openly talk out of like for a mature clientele. Therefore, it becomes like a more of an age gap. Where as I'm a younger individual, and say if I was to facilitate a workshop for a group of individuals who are like 40 plus.
Right.
So therefore they would say, okay, so a person who is younger than me is telling me what to do, which is completely normal. Of course, if we ask any kind of advice to our parents, they'd be like, "Oh, son, daughter, okay, nice for your advice, but keep it to the side, right?" So that's kind of a challenge, but it's a good challenge because that kind of puts you to the test, right? And
Right.
it's kind of rewarding at the end because now they get to learn something new from a fresh individual coming from a younger age.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and I've seen that in my life as well. I used to be a martial
Yes.
arts instructor. My father used to own a studio, uh,
Wow.
an academy, and we had many students who were much older than I was at the time when I would be teaching. So I know exactly what you mean. And there were techniques that we had to use early on to kind of make them feel comfortable, of course, offer them respect, but also let them know that there were things that I at a young age knew that they may not have. And so in your role when you work with individuals like that, where there might be an age gap, this
Yes.
might be useful for other staff to kind of learn from your experience, Shara. Have you kind of noticed anything that makes it a little easier to share your knowledge and experience with someone who might be older than you, but
Mhm.
Always looking for help?
Right. Well, if I was to like, usually I'm a facilitator in this sector focused position, right? So how I usually kind of kick things off is starting off with an icebreaker. I know it sounds super basic to many of us. However, it kind of shakes things up because like certain individuals coming from a different country in a labor market where things are done by the books, by time and scheduled time, right? However, according to us, like for me, I'm pretty open. So I let them know who I am as a personality first. I kind of tell them, okay, although this is my position, my authority, however, this is my personality at the same time. So I can be as much open as I want, and therefore they can be a little more, how can I say, a little more safe within my circle, right?
Yeah,
That's pretty important because most individual kind of feeling more vulnerable, right? So as coming to a new country, I know they might be a little more reluctant to like being open,
that
right?
is I've always found that helpful in anything I do as well is kind of the more you share, the more people are willing to share. But if you ask them without sharing anything on your own, then I
Yeah,
kind of see that reluctance. So you kind of have to put yourself out
exactly.
on other people too. That's a great reminder. And hopefully for other kind of CDPs and employment center staff watching this episode, if you're kind of looking for ways to connect with your clients, I think that's a great piece of advice, Shara, to kind of, share something about yourself that might help them open up. Um, Now, for many of those individuals, are they, these are mid-career professionals, right? Kind of looking to go from one career into a similar line of work that they were in before?
It's usually those who wants to reintegrate back into the positions in the Canadian labor market.
Okay.
Right.
Um, yeah, which can be challenging. And
Oh, it
I
is.
any stories around how that can sometimes mean going back to school. It can sometimes mean having to get recertified,
Mhm.
or for some it can mean entirely changing industries because they don't want to go through that process again. So I guess where do you start with folks when they come to you and say, hey, this is what I used to do, and now I'm here and I'm trying to figure out what happens next. Do you start asking questions around, helping them get recertified or look at schooling options or try to figure out if they want to enter another industry or how do you help those individuals kind of figure out what to do next?
Great. That's actually a good question. So, currently I'm doing a course at the moment. So I came across this theory that you know what I kind of put it to the test. It's called the classical career life cycle development theory. So there are five factors to it, which is assess, explore, plan and achieve. So when we do visit or come across new job seekers who wants to reintegrate back into their field, they were expected so soon, which is impossible because, according to the different labor markets, there are different expectations, unfortunately, right? So this is where we have to help them embed into their minds when you come to a different country with new labor market systems, you kind of have to start from the bottom, but not from scratch, but also depending on their circumstance, right? So assess meaning like, okay, what are their conducting like a self-assessment. What are their needs? What are their short-term goals, long-term goals? What do they actually need to acquire to get back into their field? The next method will be exploring. So what are some different community resources that they can also kind of amplify their profile? And what are other skills they need to kind of refurbish in Canadian labor market terms, right? Um, I'm so sorry. And then planning. Okay, so there we go. Now after kind of doing the assessment and exploring. So now how we can put it to the test of planning to reintegrate back into your career, right? So whom do we go to, like in a sense, networking events, different job events as well, right? So in a sense, people tend to do the old traditional of applying to jobs, like going up to the person and submitting your resume. No, now everything's all digitized and virtualized, right? So
Right.
everything's kind of within a click, right? So it's just a matter of fact, okay, so how can you kind of personal brand yourself? How can you put yourself into the market, right? So you're like your own salesperson. So that case, and then with all your self-assessing, and then how can you explore different resources and planning your own career? Now, how can you put it to the test by putting it into action, right? So if we put all those methods into play, I think we can see all those results, and that became an actual achievement actually as well, right? Because we do have a lot of fresh recruits, so those who don't have a lot of years of experience, so this is where I put like, okay, this is the theory that I follow. Look at it. Now let's create an action plan and now let's put a test. But the things you have to be a little more proactive. It's not a one-man person uh, job, right? So therefore, I have to see how resilient you are in this new labor market system.
Yeah, that was such a good answer, Shar. I learned a ton from listening to that, and I'm gonna have to have our editing team kind of put that theory into the comments here so that people can kind of reflect on that process. But thank you for providing that structure because I thought that might have been a challenging question because it's tough to know where to start with some of these things, but that is a really
Mhm.
tangible way to approach it, to figure out, what are the short and long-term goals? What sorts of options could lead us towards kind of accomplishing those? And then, how are we going to start planning and take action? Really, really helpful framework. And I have that correct, right? Assess, explore, plan, action,
And achieve.
and achieve. Okay.
Yes.
That is really helpful. And you reminded me something when you talked about the short-term goals because I think it kind of goes back to something you were saying there about the timeline. I think people, um, and I can't blame them, kind of
No.
expect that they're going to jump right back into what they were doing. And why wouldn't you expect that? You were just doing it. But
Yes.
this idea of setting short-term goals as you work towards a long-term goal, I think is so helpful in so many ways. So do you have an example of what that might look like? Like for an individual coming to you, what's an example of a long-term goal and some of the short-term goals that are kind of in between where they are and ultimately getting to that long-term goal?
Great. Okay. So, well, I work for an engineering program. So, right. So kind of help individuals who try to integrate back into their domain and specialization. So I'll talk in that kind of verbiage. So, for example, so say if a highly experienced candidate who wants to jump right into their field right away, which is kind of impossible at this rate. So we had to kind of take it step by step. So again, short-term goals. So in a sense, what are the Canadian systems looking for? What are like some certifications or skills you need to kind of like put yourself out there so for you can get more traction by employers and recruiters. So therefore, those who may have some sort of a language barrier. So therefore, I'll kind of focus on customer service job, but within like a certain kind of sector in your field. For example, work at Home Depot, Walmart, but however, work in the hardware section, right? So therefore you can get a lot of traction with from contractors or construction workers, whoever working in that kind of specific field. So you're kind of marketing yourself in a way where like conducting a small talk, which means like, okay, so like how we did earlier, right? Imran, like, oh, so how's everything? How's long weekend? But in this case, so if the contractor comes up to you and asks like, hey, buddy, so I see you're working in this kind of department. So what are you doing? Then therefore you can kind of open up. So this is my background. This is the years of experience that I have. But I'm kind of having a little difficulty getting back into the labor market, right? So therefore, if you have that kind of communication and networking, that kind of paves the path of getting back into your field just by networking.
That is a really, really helpful piece of advice as well, Shara, because I expected, survival jobs to be part of the short-term planning, uh,
Yeah.
which, that might be the case for me because I've been having more of these conversations. But even that alone, I think is worth kind of reflecting on for the job seekers watching this episode that, the ultimate goal might be to be back in an engineering firm. But along the way, if you're working a short-term role, that's still success, right? That's still like a short-term goal accomplished,
Exactly.
which I think is so helpful for people to kind of reframe their expectations that they don't have to feel like, well, I'm not where I want to be, but you are getting there.
It
You're
would
kind of,
lead to something bigger.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I really think that the way you've approached it takes it one step further. It's not just any survival job, so to speak. It's working in the hardware section, um, to kind of get that small talk or in context of your industry. That is really
Yes.
interesting, and that could be applied for anyone, right? You don't
Right.
have to be in engineering. You could
No,
be working, interested in business and be working in the
business, IT, or whatever sector.
staples or something.
Yes.
That is really helpful
Mhm.
advice, Shara. Um, Now, the other thing you kind of got started talking about was the networking that can come from that, which is another really interesting sort of approach to meeting people from the industry.
Right.
Because I think you're right. If I saw someone, at a Home Depot who can explain to me things about, a project I'm working on, in a level of detail I wouldn't expect, it would be like kind of like, how do you know that or what, what's your
Mhm.
background? And suddenly I come from a mechanical engineering background. I know people who would be hiring. And if that person said, "Oh, well, I'm actually looking for a job in that field," I could easily make the connection. Um, so do you have other suggestions on kind of ways to network and sort of meet people who might be able to introduce you to opportunities? Because that's one I haven't heard before. I'm curious if you have any other ones.
Right. Good question. The first and foremost, have a good resume, right? That's your ticket to an interview. If you don't formulate a good resume, then you're not going to get interviews, and it's going to be a little difficult to kind of network because say if it's more of an face to face, then you can just kind of like more introduce yourself about your background and then what's your kind of long-term goal, right? But say if someone, for example, if you submit your documents online and then they ask questions based on that. So if you don't have a strong resume, then it's going to be really difficult for you to back yourself up in a sense. What are some main points for you to deliver to what questions that interviewer or that person that's trying to communicate with you, right? When you try to do some sort of communication. So it'll be a little careful of like how you build your resume, and then from there you can kind of go up the ladder.
Now, that's a very helpful point, and it immediately makes me wonder something that I think a lot of international um, students, as well as mid-career professionals, ask me, and that is that on the resume, can they include work experience from abroad, from before they were in Canada? Because I think there's this kind of worry that Canadian employers are looking for Canadian work experience, and what's kind of your sense of that?
Well, you have to show off your experience in a way, right? I know, like in the eyes of Canadian employers, of course, they want to look for Canadian experience, but they want to know how you are back home.
Yeah.
So in an interview, when they say, "Okay, so tell me about your previous experience," although it's not Canadian, but you can still explain like, okay, so this is your level of skills, your knowledge and expertise in this role. And now how can you transfer your skills into the Canadian labor market system, specifically focusing on this position you can say in this company in Canada.
Okay, that's extremely clarifying. So again, for the job seekers watching this one, you're not limited to only putting Canadian experience on your resume. There's absolute value in adding things from, wherever it is you're coming from, because that's experience. And it might even be an advantage because you might be doing something,
Absolutely.
yeah, differently, and in any circumstances are useful to talk about there. Um, Now, when it comes to the interview itself, Shara, are you seeing anything that we should remind job seekers to avoid? Things that they can kind of take an interview opportunity, and kind of steer it in the wrong direction, sort of things, red flags, if you will, um,
Right.
that might not be immediately obvious. Anything coming to mind around kind of things to not do in an interview setting?
don't over don't over prepare, right? It's going to seem like you're reading off a script. I learned it the hard way and I got called up for that in my early job seeking interview stages. So I kind
Yeah.
of learned my lesson over the years. So it's more about like you being calm, practice some self-care before you go into an interview. And my best strategy is going into an interview as if you're going to talk to someone. Right. So like the thing is, of course, even for myself too, I get really anxious. And then when I get anxious, I talk super fast and then I stutter. And then the interview is like, oh, okay, so what is Shara saying? So therefore, even I tell my participants, like, hey, you know what? I know it's nervous because of your second language, English, but it's not a problem. But talk to someone as if you're having a formal conversation.
Right.
But as long as you're kind of paying attention what the questions are being asked.
Uh,
So that's what I would kind of tell them, kind of keep calm and do your best.
That's a very helpful reminder as well. And I've seen it too, where people, it's almost like they didn't hear the question because they'll kind of launch into a script they've prepared. And
Right.
then you don't get to make a connection. It doesn't really feel like you're talking to them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, because they've kind of written something and memorized it. And many times people will ask, well, what should I say if I get asked this? And kind of to your point, Shara, it's not really about memorizing anything. It's more so about talking to this other person you might end up working with.
It's
Uh,
more about your personality at the end of the day. That's
yeah,
what they mainly look for rather than what's coming out of your mouth.
that which makes sense, right? These are just other people that are trying to figure out if
Yes.
they work with you. And if you can have a conversation, that's got to be the starting point of being able to work together.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's super helpful as well. Um, Now we don't have a ton of time left here. I know we're coming up pretty close to the end already.
No problem.
So I'm kind of curious, just in the space you're in, are you starting to notice specific skill sets or job titles that have been more in demand kind of in recent time here? Um, could be an industry that's kind of exploding. Um, yeah, specific skill sets you're hearing employers look for or specific jobs that we can maybe just let job seekers know about to give them a sense of what they might check out.
Right. Yes. You know what? That is somewhat of a difficult question because there is no set um, like of what is the most popular sector at the moment. Is just more what's more in demand, right? So if you look at the supply and demand chain, I would say I'm going to be a little biased because I work with the engineering field. So I would say right now I'm seeing a lot of engineering positions being a little booming. IT is the runner-up, um, and then finance.
Okay.
I hope I'm right. I'm pretty sure my colleagues out in the employment world can correct me on that, but that's what I'm kind of seeing in my point of view. Um, so that's all I can branch upon that.
No, that makes sense. I mean, engineering and specifically has kind of a lot going on
Yes,
in
yes.
software right now, but there are enormous kind of transformations happening um, in almost every field of engineering as we kind of see AI start to play a role,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, in non-traditional spaces. And the same thing I think is happening in the finance world as well. You're starting to see a lot more of these, robo advisors, tools that make it a little easier to get personalized sort of insights.
Yeah,
Um, and for better or for worse, it kind of seems to be the way things are going. Um, but on the other side of that, it kind of goes back to what you were saying before about just having these conversations. I think that while AI kind of does its thing, there's becoming a need for these kind of more human roles and these this need for people who can connect with other people.
absolutely.
Are you kind of noticing that as well?
Yeah, like what I tell my participants is like conduct like an informational interview. So AKA like have a casual conversation, right? It's not
Yeah.
like you're actually performing an actual interview. It's just like, okay, what information are you trying to gain from the speaker that you're trying to talk to? And then from there, how can you branch out into different avenues of your career?
Well, it's funny you say that because, again, just having an engineering background, I know that there was a
Yeah.
mentality that being an engineer means you don't really have to talk to anyone because
Oh,
you can just
I
like,
heard that many times.
in my experience, that's not the case. And I'm just curious, from your
Mhm.
standpoint, are you seeing that ability be an asset to engineers? This ability to kind of, talk to people and present or share ideas. I'm just
Oh,
curious.
100%. Yes, communication is pretty much a popular skill in every sector. You must have it, and but it's something that you cannot like properly perfect because I know like English can be a second language to most, right? So this is therefore we kind of have to find a strategy of how to perfect your or improve on your English language skills and your presentation skills. Because for industry professionals, you have to have good presentation skills, right? So how can we work on your language to perfect your presentation skills? So
Right.
this is where we kind of focus on kind of like mock activities, such as like mock interviews or mock presentations, just to give them or uplift their confidence in presenting.
That makes sense. And I kind of see it. It's where I think engineers distinguish themselves kind of along the way.
100%.
It's kind of how, one engineer will get picked for a promotion into kind of a management role. It's those
Hmm.
individuals who have developed that skill set. And not that
Right.
everyone may want to be a manager, but it just gives you the option.
Hmm.
If you kind of, do what you're saying here and get kind of good at having those conversations, informational interviews, being able to present. Um,
Right.
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it because I know engineers can be resistant to
Oh,
developing that
oh yeah,
skill.
oh yeah. Especially with a younger fellow like me.
Yeah,
Yeah, they will.
but it's so valuable, and I feel like
Yes.
we're both coming from the right place to explain that to folks because yeah, as I say, my degree is in engineering. I spent a lot of time around engineers,
Oh yeah,
extremely talented,
for sure.
extremely smart individuals, and the ones who can express themselves just have that added advantage. So I'm glad that you agree with that.
Exactly, yes.
I only have
Oh,
two more
no
minutes
problem.
of your time here, Shara. And sorry, I might
Sure,
have
no
cut
problem.
it glitched out for me for a second, but do you have any kind of final thoughts, whether it be advice, tips, insights, that you'd like to kind of share with, the job seekers or the staff that are watching this episode?
Um, this is going to be general. Usually I'll usually tell my participants and to my own circle as well. The choices you make makes you, as long as you don't regret the choices you made, right? We can all make choices, but as long as it's gonna benefit us or it's gonna really hurt us at the long run. And also know your resources. Now we're all digitized and everything. Now we have to kind of know how to manipulate and use social media to our advantage. So therefore, kind of surf the web how to find the right resource that can benefit to your career.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for the time here today,
No
Shara.
problem. Thank you for the invitation and putting me on this podcast.
Oh, absolutely. I'm really glad you came. I hope we can have you back in the future.
Oh,
Uh,
sure.
Super tangible insights today. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure
Appreciate it so
those
much.
watching will too.
Great. Take care.
All right, Shara. You have a good one.